Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. So today we have discussed about what is HTTP request and HTTP response in web APIs. So first of all, this is a very basic thing, or this is for basically for beginner, right? So in this video we'll focus on mainly what is HTTP request and what is HTTP response. So let's discuss one by one. First one is HTTP request. So HTTP request, when we send some data, right? When we send something from our client to the server, right? When we send some data to our client to the server, suppose this is a client and this is a server. When we send some data or something to our client to the server, this is called a request, right? We can send from any client or browser or any postman, any SOAP UI, right? Whenever we send any data from our client to server, that is called request, HTTP request, right? After that, there is some component in this request, right? uh, I have already mentioned that first one is URL. So each request must have URL, right? URL is mandatory for HTTP request or any HTTP calling. And second one is verb, is also called a method. So verb also, each request verb is also mandatory for each request. Header is also mandatory. Header either is single or multiple header. You can send as per your requirement. So this is also a mandatory method, mandatory components in HTTP request. And fourth one is body. Body is also, each request must have body, right? And fifth one is data. If we send some request to the server, so there is some data in this request, right? So these are the main component in HTTP request pipeline, right? So each request must have these parameters: URL, verbs, headers, body, and data. Right. So let's move our on response section. So HTTP response. So let's discuss HTTP response and HTTP response and its component. So when we send, right, when whatever we get from server, right, our web server, whatever we get from our web server, that is called response, right? So server send the response to the client. Suppose we hit the request from the clients, from the browser, from the UI, from any postman, and send to the server. This web server sends some response, right? So there is some format of response in web API. So suppose first one is status code. Each request, each response have some status code. Each request some response header or some data, right? So this is also a mandatory things in response section. We receive the status code of uh, response, header, and data. There is some data which we get from our server, right? So each response must have these three component, or we have uh, we have more component to receive response from the web server, but this is mandatory, right? From our web server. So this is basically HTTP request and HTTP response.